Welcome everybody to Transit Talk. Thank you all for joining. We're making a recording of this so that we can post it on our social media and on YouTube and stuff. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Today's talk is a really interesting issue. I think all the Transit Talk issues are interesting, you know, because I'm a transit nerd, but you may not be. But today we're talking about the intersection between issues on aging and transportation. And of course, that's sort of the heart of what VIA does. And that was one of our reasons for being founded about 40 years ago. It's a big issue for everyone. From the statistics tell us that from between 2018 and 2050, the state of Colorado estimates that the number of adults aged 65 and older will double from about 806,000 to more than 1.6 million people. So when you think about it, that's an unprecedented change in our in human history. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. Anybody else hearing that? No? Went away. Okay.
No.
So that's a really unprecedented time in human history when you think about the proportion of older adults to younger people switching, changing in such a dramatic fashion. And that's really going to have an impact and repercussions on every community and all levels of government. So it's a really important issue for us, and it's one that we work with every day at VIA. Another point to consider about that shift in the population demographics is that gap between health span and lifespan. If everybody would mute themselves right now, there we go. I think that'll help with it. I was getting feedback. So that that gap between health span and lifespan is going to be really critical for us as a society. In other words, the time when a person reaches the point at which they're no longer healthy and begin to have chronic illnesses and health issues, and the end of life. And it's been suggested that that average gap between that health span and lifespan right now is roughly about 15 years. And that's a significant gap in terms of your quality of life and both the healthcare costs that are going to arise with that. So it's addressing that gap and how to close it is becoming a priority for people and families and communities and all levels of government. At VIA Mobility Services, which is a nonprofit community transit agency, providing both paratransit transportation as well as public transit, we play an important role in addressing health issues related to aging by providing access to health care and jobs and other things that are important to living to your quality of life. So we're very interested in this issue and what our two speakers have to tell us tonight. We're fortunate to have two gentlemen who have been working very closely on the state of Colorado's efforts to address the issues and needs related to our growing population of older adults. Specifically, they're working on Colorado's Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging, and that group's recommendations to the governor and the Colorado legislature on how to address and deal with these issues. So I'm going to turn it over to them in a minute. After their presentation, I'll have some questions. And then I want to invite the audience throughout that question period or the presentation to enter your questions in the chat box. If you scroll along the bottom of your screen, section where people can take themselves off mute and ask their questions directly if they want to, and tell us a little bit about themselves and what their interests are on the topic. So now I'd like to introduce Jim Collins, who is the mayor of Los Animas, Colorado. He also serves as the director of the Lower Arkansas Valley Area Agency on Aging, and as well as working with several other organizations that address issues on aging. And Jarett Hughes, who is the project administrator for Colorado's Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging. And he's responsible for herding all the cats, basically. He incorporates and integrates all of the subcommittees. There are several subcommittees to this group, their work into drafting the recommendations, and he works on authoring the strategic action plan as well as its updates. So when you two start your presentation, if you want to add a little bit to my introduction about what you do and what your responsibilities are in this area, please feel free to do so. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jarett maybe to begin the presentation. And are you able to share your screen for the presentation, Jarett?
Well, you know, so we were just kind of going to approach this as more of a discussion. So I did not prepare any slides. Jim might have some, but I don't. So, you know,
that's fine.
I appreciate you guys reaching out and asking us to join you. I know Zoe's been involved with our work for, I want to say probably over maybe 2.5 years at this point. So we appreciate having Via at the table and sharing your perspectives, because I know when I come at this from not a transit world perspective. So I have learned a lot about the transportation world in Colorado over the last 3.5 years. So Lisa's right. I work as the project administrator for the planning group. And you know, in that role, you know, I get to work with a lot of great folks such as Jim down in the southeast part of the state, and then other individuals from across Colorado. And so, you know, one of the things I always kind of harp on when we're doing these sorts of things is, you know, when we talk about aging in Colorado and really anywhere, you know, it's much more of a life course issue than just a 60 plus or a 50 plus or 65 plus. So I try to look at this from the perspective of, you know, how do we get more individuals in their 30s and their 40s to kind of start thinking about and talking about a lot of these issues and preparing for what life has to offer. And one of the other demographic things I always like to try and point out is that we are experiencing that push of the baby boomers moving into that 65 plus category, but there are also just as many millennials in Colorado as baby boomers right now. So when those folks in their 30s and 40s continue to age up, we will be looking at a new normal of age distribution across the state and across the country. And that is historically unique and unprecedented. So, you know, the other piece I just want to add real quick before I turn it over to Jim is that, you know, the planning group was created in 2015 by the state legislature to really kind of take a pretty comprehensive look at aging and older adult issues. Kind of like I said, in line with, well, you know, historically, a lot of the focus has been on frailty and disability and decline when you talk about older adults. But the reality is that older adults are a vibrant piece of our communities, and while chronic conditions do increase as we age, and I know, Lisa, I can tell you that you were reading the 2019 action plan, and I appreciate that. But, you know, even when confronted with chronic conditions and disabilities, individuals tend to adapt and, you know, optimize the skills they do have, and they're able to maintain that quality of life. So that's not always the case, but there's plenty of academic research that supports that even if you do have these chronic conditions and your activities of daily living are you know, restricted in a way, your quality of life may not be decreasing at the same time. So we are resilient and adaptive, and that's an important component, I think, to always add to that. So I'll stop there and let Jim go a little bit, and then we'll just kind of fill in the blanks off of one another from there on.
So thank you, Jarett. One thing Jarett didn't tell you, and I hope I don't offend you, Jarett, telling you this, but Jarett's work on the SAPCA board has been significant. It's been an honor to work with him, but he was just very recently selected to become the new senior advisor on aging to the governor. So now his work really expands and his cat herd gets bigger. So I'm looking forward to working with him again in that capacity. So as Lisa said, I have the privilege of serving in a multitude of areas. Today was a perfect example of that. I sat on 5 different supposedly subject matter expert boards to gather at listening session type needs assessment type work, and all of them were related. And that's the one thing I found with this transportation survey is as we got into it, everything's related. Aging in place and aging well in place are 2 distinctly different animals, and transportation can make all the difference in the world with that. So we started trying to build a program, or at least some sort of a plan that would allow people to age well in place, and that's critical. In rural Colorado and rural United States in general, even in rural the world actually, people that are in those areas are there because they stopped there when their wagons quit rolling, and they've stayed there ever since then, or they've decided they were tired of metro and decided to move out here. And in that case, or in both those cases, they still need the same services that are available sometimes only on the Front Range. As you know, primary care providers and especially specialty care providers, medical providers, are very, very minimal, if non-existent, in rural Colorado as is throughout the country. But our needs still exist. I mean, people still need to get there. So my focus has been throughout this whole thing is to bring to light the fact that it's not necessarily a choice that transportation exists. It's a necessity in order for someone to some degree to even stay alive, or extreme preventive medicine measures. We need to transport people, and we've actually worked very hard to develop a plan that I'm very proud of, and Jarett did a great job on to somewhat address that, and we're moving forward with it. At the same time, right in the middle of this, we went into this huge Medicaid renegotiation of contracts and became a single source provider for Medicaid. So we're starting this at the very end of our planning session here and report delivery. All of a sudden we have a whole new program in place. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out in the long run. And I'm kind of anxious to see how that pans out. So basically, I'm not going to talk too much. Jarett hit it right on the head. Let's just have a very formal or informal discussion. And I'd love to hear your questions. And I think Jarett will answer 90% of them, but I'll sure try.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim. And I do appreciate your kind words. And yeah, when I recently I'll be leaving the planning group in the middle of November and beginning of the governor's office shortly after that. But I think the primary goal in this policy advisor position within the governor's office is to integrate these perspectives into existing state efforts, and also to kind of move forward on the work that we've been doing over the last 5 years. So I think that's it's a really exciting opportunity. It'll come with its own unique roadblocks. Obviously, we all know how COVID-19 has impacted our lives and our work, and especially in the metro areas. And so kind of trying to harness what we can and do what we can from there on. But, a lot of our transportation committee work this past year kind of focused on, Jim touched on the NEMT brokerage expansion through Medicaid. And that's been a big piece for a lot of the providers outside of that, that 9 county metro area where IntelliRide has operated for the past couple of, I guess maybe that contract's only been in place for about 1.5 years or maybe a year at this point. But they've expanded statewide now. And so, one of the main things that the planning group believes, and I believe, and we talked about in our transportation committee meeting, is that our meetings throughout the year, is the importance of having service providers at the table when we're having these policy planning discussions, because all too often what happens is that you have county commissioners and state legislators and different policy people kind of establishing what happens. And more often than not, that's done based on, fiscal and financial reasoning. So with this brokerage expansion across parts of the state, I think, and this is just based on my conversations with different folks around Colorado, but I think Jim down in his region, they've done a really great job integrating and kind of coordinating with IntelliRide to move forward. But I have also heard some of those kind of, I don't want to call them horror stories, but just kind of those stories about, people just not getting picked up, calls getting dropped, just the shift that the local providers know about, that a brokerage system set up outside of state's not adept at coordinating.
Just to sort of clarify what you're talking about for some folks who may not be familiar with the term NEMT, non-emergency medical transportation, we might want to expand a little bit on some of the problems that our rural residents face. I know that those of us who work in this particular field are very much aware of that disparity between the services that are available to rural communities and those that are available in urban areas. And I know from personal experience, my father-in-law, who lives out on the plains in eastern Colorado, had a stroke not too long ago, and they have a very small hospital out there, and he had to be medevaced from that hospital to the Front Range to another hospital. So I wonder if either or both of you could kind of just address what some of those needs are, those gaps in services that are existing between the rural and the urban areas, because I think that sort of relates to what some of your recommendations are to the committee, to the legislature going forward about rural transportation services and networks. Jim, do you want to?
Would you like me to field that?
Sure.
Okay, so I get to live this every day, and I like to talk about it. So the Medicaid service of NEMT, the non-emergent medical care, basically NEMT stands for a trip that is a planned trip that, so for example, let's just say today I have a person who lives in Campo, Colorado, and they need to get to Denver for a medical appointment, right? And they don't have transportation. They can't drive themselves. So, and there's also not a bus that goes there, right? So what we do is we coordinate through a series of agencies to get a door-to-door service for that client. And that's critical because in the past, what we've talked about is what's called first mile, last mile. So even in the transit world, if I could get you to a bus stop and then you get to the other end bus stop, you still got to get from bus stop to home and from bus stop to doctor's office, back and forth. So that's the first mile, last mile challenge. NEMT basically addresses that challenge. So we do door-to-door service. And understand that, like I said, Medicaid is one piece of that puzzle. So we also have veteran transportation that's available. We have, in my region, we have the community service block grant that pays for low-income people who are not Medicaid and they're not veteran. So we still have funding available for that. And then there's different agencies out there who have sponsored us. In our case, with Ansha's Foundation, has done a really good job of stepping up and helping us do that. But it's predominantly done with a series of nonprofit agencies or volunteers who step up and provide the drive their own car. And like with IntelliRide, if you're doing that, that's called reimbursement transportation. So I could take a person, drop them off, do the thing, and turn in the paperwork, get reimbursement for it. And it's basically the same thing. So it's not ambulance driving. It's not riding the bus. It could be riding the bus if we can do the first mile, last mile portion of it. So it's quite literally a puzzle that we put together on a day-to-day basis to get people to where they need to be. And one of our biggest challenges was those long-term subscription type care, like dialysis or chemo. So a person's got to be there every day, and especially with Medicaid, if a person misses that appointment, it's almost 10 times the cost because now it is an emergency transportation, and it's significant for that difference. So it's important that we were able to put those pieces together. But it's even more important that now that we've demonstrated that it can be done, that we need to actually expand that into all regions of the state and make it a viable option for all people throughout the state.
Yeah, dialysis care is a big issue for us as well. We have a pretty high percentage, and I know Lisa Bitzer, our Director of Operations, is on this call. We have a pretty high percentage of the paratransit rides that we provide that are for dialysis treatments. I'm wondering what, I know that the task force is making recommendations specifically in the area of transportation. What are the recommendations to address improving that system, that network for non-emergent transportation?
Well, so, I'll kind of jump in and before getting to that, can I just ask real quick, and maybe Lisa, either Lisa might know this, if you had to kind of guess a percentage of your trips that would be dialysis, do you know that maybe off the top of your head, or is that something you'd have to kind of dig into a little bit?
I'd say probably 20%.
Yeah, and I mean, I just wanted to ask that real quick, and that, I mean, dialysis transportation was a really big piece of work throughout 2018 and 2019, and it continues to be something that different stakeholder groups around the state continue to look at, because it is one of those unique NEMT trips. But, when it comes to the recommendations that will be in the forthcoming 2020 update, I kind of touched on one of those strategies that we've kind of identified for supporting local transportation service provision is just having transportation providers at the table at these state level policy decision making discussions. So that's kind of step one. Making sure the disability community has been are wonderful advocates, nothing for us without us. And that's kind of an attitude that I think community-based organizations and service providers should bring to policymaking, and kind of integrating themselves into the processes that are kind of there. So even like obvious examples, Zoe just being a part of our group and being able to integrate that perspective. And, we do, I will admit, we do a good job of working with community-based organizations and bringing folks in, but that's not always the case. And that's especially not always the case when you get into some of the department level decision-making. I think that I've been very impressed by the way the Department of Transportation is able to support their folks, and a lot of their the Federal Transit Administration grant teams. But our Rural Transportation Committee discussions this year really kind of revolved around, I think, what I kind of described as a top-down, bottom-up approach, where the state needs to support human service transportation more than they do. If you spend time around the Capitol, transportation conversations tend to focus on infrastructure. So you talk a lot about roads and bridges and the laundry list of projects that we have around the state, but human service transportation often gets lost in the mix. So one of the other pieces of our recommendations this year is kind of bringing this non-emergency medical transportation piece and bringing the perspective of the local providers to the legislature. So one of our recommendations is that the Colorado Association of Transit Agencies should coordinate with the transportation committees in the House and the Senate to do annual updates and presentations. Because early on during legislative sessions, there's often not too much happening the first few weeks, the first month. Some bills are being introduced, but you're not getting those nights where folks are in committee hearings until midnight or 1 a.m. But oftentimes what the committees of reference will do, and the committees of reference is where a bill gets referred to by the Speaker of the House or the President of the Senate after it's introduced. But those committees of reference do invite in community stakeholders to do presentations and kind of update them on the landscape of what things currently look like. And so just getting transit providers and paratransit providers in front of those policymakers to share those perspectives is an important first step. So that's kind of the top piece. And then the bottom up approach, that community-based approach, we believe firmly that local problem solving and local solutions are better than a one-size-fits-all solution at the state level. Funding and prioritization are a must at the top, but at the bottom level, local transportation coordination and the importance of mobility management. And so, mobility managers play a unique process or a unique role in that process of being able to pull together resources and build coalitions across regions. And that's one of those big pieces that I think it's common across the state, but they're often funded through federal dollars or through local governments. And so there's a role for the state to play in supporting that as well. And then I know I see Andrea on the call, and I wouldn't be surprised if a few other of you are involved in your local coordinating council or your regional coordinating councils. Mm-hmm. But that's another great example of community-based engagement and involvement. And what I've been really impressed by over the last 3 years of kind of working on these transit-related issues is just that local buy-in that the LCCs and the RCCs are able to generate. But a lot of that's done on a volunteer basis. And so, part of our work through the planning group is to also look at what other states do. Florida, for example, has, I believe it's called the transportation, oh gosh, I got it somewhere on my computer. The Florida Commission for the Transportation Disadvantaged. And it's essentially a local coordinating, regional coordinating model, but it's integrated within their state DOT. And they have budget authority, they have rulemaking authority, and it's a much more integrated process than we have here in Colorado. Mm-hmm. We didn't spend too much time in our transportation committee talking about that, but it is something that was kind of brought to me. I think Ann Rajewski and Kate Williams introduced it to me. And so that's just a model kind of integrating that local engagement into state policymaking.
One thing, and I'm inviting anybody to kind of chime in here. One of the problems we find as a provider is that the healthcare providers themselves, the hospitals and the dialysis centers, are not engaged with the transportation project. They're kind of leaving it up to others to solve. And I think that local that local network must include the healthcare providers as well. I think they have to start stepping up to recognize their role in the process. And I know the NEMT issue with the statewide provider has just been a number of headaches, and Lisa Bitzer can probably address this. We provide services on our own. We're not part of the NEMT network, but we get the calls asking us to rescue their clients who've been left at places without a return trip. Lisa,
yeah,
you want to?
There isn't a day that goes by, unfortunately, that we don't get those calls that are people that are stranded, that they've been waiting 3, 4, 5, 6 hours for a return ride home, or that they never got picked up to begin with from home to get to their appointment. And like Lisa said, we don't currently do anything with the NEMT, the Medicaid, medical therapy and dental part. So when people call us and they want a ride, refer them to IntelliRide or to some other options that are out there for them that, there's no way that via being a private nonprofit can meet the huge demand of people not wanting to use IntelliRide and wanting to ride with us. We just can't do it. It seems like it's worse. There's always been problems through all the different state providers. There was VAO, there was all the rest of them. And we've been part of that up until VAO, and then we didn't renew the contract. And now IntelliRide. But is there anything that a person can do that is, that something can be done when they don't get picked up and when they get stranded? Who do they go to, and how do they put that complaint in where it can be heard and lodged and someone can see it and do something about it? Because like I said, there isn't a day that goes by that we don't get usually multiple phone calls on this issue.
So toward the end of our, I'm sorry, Jarett, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but toward the end of our planning session, we actually started meeting with and are still working, I'm hoping, with one of the national coordinators for Lyft. So what you're describing there is not necessarily NEMT as much as it is what I call point of purchase transportation. They need a ride. They got delivered to the hospital, for example, and with an ambulance, and now there's no ride home. So what will be nice if we can work this out is to actually have it where they can just call Lyft and say, I need a ride home, and bill it to whoever bills. Currently in rural Colorado, we don't have Uber or Lyft, in my region anyway. So that's what we're trying to do, is actually work on a pilot program for that. In the meantime, all my drivers are volunteers. So typically when I get the call, just like you do, that, and of course it's a very small piece compared to what you're doing at Metro, but if I get a call and someone needs a ride home, I simply text it out to my drivers and someone goes, I got it, we'll go take care of them. But that's the beauty of small town USA. We all know each other. We're families, so usually by the time someone gets the call, someone else has already got the call or something, and it gets taken care of. But it definitely is. That point of purchase transportation is the one piece we're missing, and that's the one piece that's critical that we add into the audit that is being recommended for the IntelliRide program, to see down the line that it actually is or is not working well. I'm sorry, Jarett, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Lisa, all I was going to say was, unfortunately, I think it's one of those situations where there's no immediate solution to any of that. But I do think that one thing that I know Anne at the Colorado Association of Transit Agencies they've been collecting those stories. They've kind of been, I think it's been, I'll admit it, it's been probably a month and a half or 2 months since I've talked to her about this, but they were kind of trying to establish some metrics that they could use to kind of gauge what local transit providers are experiencing based on these NEMT expansion. So missed trips, dropped calls, how long are they waiting before they can get their rides? And I think that, again, it's not one of those immediate solution things, but those stories do have power, I believe. And so, especially when it comes to approaching either your county commissioners or your state representatives or your state senators, if you have those experiences and those stories on hand to share, those are the things that really make a difference to them. From my experience, that's kind of what I've gathered. So it's one of those things that you can be used in the future, but the immediate solution, I think, Jim brings up kind of conversations that we had with Lyft, and a lot of that kind of was born out of conversations with folks on the Western Slope, kind of in the Montrose, San Miguel Uray area, and Tri-County Health is their public health system out there, and their Tri-County Health Network partnered with Lyft to train, see if I get this right, they were using Tri-County Health employees. They would get Lyft certified, and then they had dollars coming in that they were able to pay those public health employees to provide the rides. So they provided the supply for the trip, and then the public health network had the demand for the individuals that needed different trips. And so it was kind of a cyclical process that they were able to put into place. And Jim and I had been in touch with a gentleman named Jake with Lyft to talk about that. And his sense on that was it was unique across the country. He could not think of other opportunities or examples of where that was going on. Doesn't mean it wasn't happening, but to his knowledge, it wasn't. But with so many different funding streams at play, I mean, it's kind of like, it's just like healthcare. There are so many different payers involved that you kind of just have to put one puzzle piece in a different place, but there's always some piece where there's a gap, like there's a piece that's missing, and it's just kind of trying to close those.
I think there was a question from Andrea a minute ago about whether the MPOs could make a difference.
Yeah, I certainly think so. And I think that, I can't speak for too many other than, the DRCOG region, but, from my experience, they seem to do a pretty good job of supporting and coordinating with local providers. And I also think that the Pikes Peak Council of Associated Governments has done a good job with Invita down there. And I hear great things about the Grand Valley NPO, but it's honestly not it's not something I'm incredibly familiar with, other than kind of the peripheral understanding.
So when you were doing your work, I know you were in the midst of preparing your recommendations to update for your 2020 updates to the legislature, and then COVID hit. Did that change your process, or what was going on? How did that affect what you were doing?
Maybe I'll talk a little bit about how that kind of impacted our planning process, and then maybe I think Jim, with the rural perspective, could talk a little bit about how it kind of impacted his work, because there's a very clear urban-rural difference, and I don't want to say everything, but a lot of things. And so I think the urban areas, the denser populated areas, were hit much harder than this, and things changed to a much larger degree than I believe in rural regions. And I base that on conversations I've had with folks around ombudsmen, adult protective services, and transportation. So, but for our planning process, we really wanted to try and incorporate, how these shifts were impacting local providers, and trying to figure out what did this new reality look like. And I think that was our initial goal. And I think what we kind of found along the way was that everyone was still in so much of kind of a crisis response mode that it was really hard to even conceptualize what the takeaways were from it. So I think we had a tough time figuring out what the lasting impacts would be, because folks were still just kind of responding in their own little worlds. But we know that public transit ridership is going to be down. We know that you're not going to be able to group rides in the same way that you were in the past, and all of that has inefficiencies for the overall system. And it's already a heavily subsidized industry as is. Those of you in the transit world know you're not getting the return on your investment for providing trips. So it's just, that was pre-COVID. And so now it's even more accentuated, I guess.
So
I think we could, if people want to raise their hands and ask their questions directly, please feel free to do so. I noticed too, we have our CEO, Frank Bruno's on the line, and he's been keeping track of the conversation. Frank, did you have anything you wanted to ask?
Not a specific question, just wanted to thank, I mean, I enjoy the richness of these sessions that we've been doing where we've been touching on different key subject areas, and Jim and Jarett, you guys being willing to take part in this with us brings that richness in. So, you know, you're bringing that expertise from different part of the state, and Jarett, your experience from, you know, your own world, and now where you're going to be going. So I just want to say thank you for that. And we're seeing it at VIA. Certainly our role is, you know, was maybe more segmented even when I got here 4 years ago on staff, and when I was on the board prior to that. And we're seeing our role expand more dramatically. I see Lisa Bitzer shaking her head. We're seeing communities wanting more shuttle service. We're talking with the city of Littleton about their needs around medical NEMT. And so again, just thank you. I don't want to, this is not about my thoughts. I just want to say thank you for that, and to everyone for being part of this.
Thanks, Frank. I'm wondering if, you know, in the rural areas, since so much, you know, as Jim said, transportation is just a necessity. It's not in that area. If, you know, the economic impact to nonprofits or even smaller for-profit transportation providers have been huge. You know, I'm thankful that we've had a great leadership team that has gotten us via mobility services through this difficult time, but I'm imagining that for much smaller providers that are kind of the linchpin of what's going on in the rural areas, they may not have had the resources to fall back on. And Jim, can you address just, you know, what's the situation there?
So actually, I could say, I'm on the state board for the area agencies on aging as well. And one of the lucky things, if you will, was that when COVID hit, of course, all transportation stopped moving, as did making appointments or anything else. So it wasn't a big demand for transportation. And the beauty of that is we fund, through the Older Americans Act and state funding for senior services, we fund a lot of the transportation agencies are owned and managed by government agencies, by the COGS or the Board of County Commissioners. So basically what we had the potential to was they could have sat still. But we had the funding. So the interesting thing about that was that when the first round of CARES Act funding came out, the initial surge, if you will, they offered us they being the state unit on aging, offered us the flexibility to use it how we needed to get things done, which was amazing because we were, at the same time, we were fighting for flexibility and funding. So the interesting thing was, at the same time, senior centers and congregate meal sites closed down. So the same people who were going to get congregate meals now could no longer get congregate meals. So home delivered meals became the new option. Well, what better method of using home delivered meals than transportation agencies? So we simply just transitioned over from one day you're driving people, next day you're driving meals. And we paid for it just like for every meal was one person. It was a unit of measure. And it worked across the state. And honestly, it worked across the United States because we just had the M4A conference and it was the same story. All across the United States, the AAA stepped up and said, we're going to get meals into people's homes. We're going to use transportation to do it. So therefore, we were able to keep our transportation providers engaged. And then we were able to get meals into the people's homes. And even to this day, in the state of Colorado, there are no congregate meal sites, and we're still doing home delivered meals. Luckily, we have the funding and the flexibility for it, and we had visionaries sitting at the top that were able to look at it and say, let's put these two pieces together and make it happen. And it was amazing to watch, truly amazing. At the same time, through CDOT, of course, we have the busting out rider out in the rural areas. They had to shut down because of COVID. So luckily, we still had agencies that could step up and do. And I have to push for Susan. I think her last name is Jurgovich, but she was our RCC coordinator consultant at the time, and we developed this plan to keep people moving, and it worked. I mean, we kept all of our appointments up to date. I think we might have, in 6 months, we might have missed 15 appointments that had to be rescheduled a week later. But other than that, we pretty much across the board have accomplished doing things. Again, probably the most important thing was the flexibility in spending and the visionary sight, like your CEO there would have, I'm sure. And then probably one of the most important things that has come out of this whole COVID thing is the ability for us to meet with agencies like yourself. And it's truly a privilege to meet with you because we get to hear other stories and pick your brains about how to do things. And then there's so much sharing going on right now. It's just phenomenal. I've never seen anything like this in my entire life.
Lisa, do you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, Jim, I totally hear what you're saying. BIA is in the same boat. When March hit and rides really plummeted, we found very quickly that people needed food and they needed prescriptions and that kind of stuff. And so it really, in a blink of an eye, we switched gears. And we pick up from, Walmarts and King Soopers and Safeways. We got a wonderful partnership going with the Boulder County Farmers Market, bringing fresh produce to WIC families and SNAP families that, with children and pregnant women. We also work with the Community Food Share and EPA and places like that, and literally moving hundreds of boxes of food and fresh produce. The Boulder County Health Department, Olin Farms, and I would say right now, probably 40% of the rides we're doing are food in some capacity, whether it be a warm meal or produce, taking it to people's homes. And I don't see that stopping anytime in the near future. Jim, I don't know about you guys, but I see this continuing probably and being what BIA does permanently. Because there's always going to be a need. And now that we've been able to provide it, there's going to be people that are always going to be in the need, maybe not at the capacity and the level that they are now, but it'll definitely be how I think BIA moves forward in the future.
Yeah, I say this all the time, but COVID is horrible. I mean, there's no joke. COVID is horrible. But at the same time, if you look at it on an optimistic point, COVID has developed a relationship or forced the development of relationships that should never go away. I hope to God they never go away because, I mean, literally the very first week COVID happened, the school shut down in my little town of Los Angeles. The school shut down. We're a town of 2,000 people. So the school shut down and we knew right away that kids were home, that they may only, if they're on free and reduced lunch, they may only get their meals from schools. Now, in my mind, and the superintendent of school, I used to be a school teacher there, so we have a working relationship. So we said, let's deliver those meals to the kids. Right. Well, at the same time, I said, if the kids are home, and the kids' parents are home, the kids get their free and reduced lunch based on the parents' income. Wouldn't it make sense the parents need the meals too? So we used our CARES Act funding and actually paid for those parents' meals too. And the school stepped up and said, we'll prepare the meals and deliver them. So instead of just delivering a meal for little Johnny, they delivered for little Johnny and mommy and daddy. And in 2 months, we spent $40,000 and did that. But it met that need. And I thought, that's an amazing thing that I thought of, right? Well, guess what? All over the United States, everybody was doing it. So it must have come to me in a dream or something. But it's amazing that all across the United States, these relationships have sprung up. And like I said, I just hope they never go away because this is good.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think transportation companies all over the country have stepped up and filled the need. And it doesn't mean we always have to move people. We can move food. We can move other things, prescriptions. And I think that that's huge. And you're right, everyone is working together more. And I spend a lot of time on meetings and talking to people and, what are you doing? And hey, what are you doing? And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can, learn from each other. So it has, in a time of COVID where, BIA was worried about what the future holds, we have definitely been blessed, and we are being a blessing to the community in which we serve, which is very important to us.
We have a question from Debbie Noel in the chat, and Debbie Noel, you may want to wave. She's a member of our board of directors, and she asked where the funds come from to deliver the meals. Jarett, it's probably several sources. Did you want to address that question?
Yeah, so I think Debbie, I think you were referring to when Jim was talking about their shift from congregate meal sites to home delivered meals. So there's at least through the Area Agency on Aging, there's two major funding sources, and federally that's the Older Americans Act, which has different titles and different specifications for how much money can be spent on certain things, and then Colorado has, at the state level, we have state funding for senior services, which is a mix of general fund and a mix of, I think, some cash fund dollars. And so there's more flexibility around the state funding for senior services. But I think what Jim and Lisa were really touching on was they were able to get that flexibility with the Older Americans Act dollars too. And I might be wrong about that. So I would look to Jim to clarify that one.
No, you were dead on with that. But at the same time, too, each municipal agency and counties, as well as nonprofits across the board that were serving communities, were able to actually apply for multiple different levels of funding through CARES Act funding and through Colorado. Was it Colorado Helps, I think was the name of the group that stood up and were getting nonprofit donations. So some of the funding came from CARES Act funding for people that were not over 60. So again, Older Americans Act funding and state funding for senior services is for communities over 60 or people over 60. But then you had the group of people who were under 60 who were parents, they're 30, 40 years old. We were able to use CARES Act funding for that. So that was the beauty of the CARES Act funding. It basically was funding that was given to the city and said, specifically needed to address COVID issues, and very flexible on that.
Sorry, I think I had a brief internet problem there, but I'm back on. So I didn't hear that last bit. Hopefully that won't happen again before the end. I think we're about ready to wrap up. Zoe, did you notice any questions that maybe we need to address?
I don't see any, but feel free to speak up, folks, and or you're welcome to raise your hands using the raise your hand chat feature, and I'll call on you.
I want to thank Jarett and Jim for being with us today. It was really a great conversation, and nice to hear your perspective, and nice to hear what's going on at the state level. And thank you everybody who joined us, and shout out to Zoe. She's been sitting in on SAPCA meetings for quite a while now and keeping us at BIA up to date on that. We really appreciate her participation in those ongoing meetings and that activity. So I think that kind of wraps it up. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you all for having us today.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Take care,
Jim and
guys.
Jarett.
Bye, Zoe.
Bye.